We're continuing our coverage of the handiest ocean-wide expedition cruise with the Hantavirus found on board. Just a few updates, and today I want to talk about the actual effect of the virus on the immune system, which is pretty important if we're looking at how we may actually mitigate this. Some interesting data. But first, don't forget to visit us at medcram.com for more medical education videos. So where do we start here? So this is a ship called the Hantavirus, which left from Argentina on March 20th and was supposed to end on May 4th. But there's been 6 or even 7 now people that have been confirmed ill. And we're now up to at least 2 people that have been confirmed positive for Hantavirus. Now it's unclear whether or not that Hantavirus was contracted while on board, or whether that contraction occurred earlier before they boarded the ship, whether it was all from the droppings or urine or saliva of mice or rodents, or whether or not this was human to human. And that's because, as we talked about in our last video, there are certain strains of the virus, certain variants, certain types of the virus which cannot communicate from human to human, and others that can. And there's such a wide incubation or window period from 1 to 8 weeks in many of these cases that it's going to be very difficult to figure this out without further information. So, as we talked about in the last video, there were 6 people at least yesterday when we talked about this. It turns out that since that time, the wife of the index patient who died, and they did not know why he died, has actually been positive now for Hantavirus. That is confirmed. So we have somebody in the intensive care unit who is still fighting for his life in Johannesburg in ICU that is positive for Hantavirus. And now the wife, unfortunately, of the first man who died on board the ship is also now turned positive for Hantavirus. Interestingly, she went from St. Helena to Johannesburg International Airport to catch a flight and unfortunately collapsed in the airport. And so that has brought up some questions about index and tracing and things of that nature. For those of you who are watching this for the first time, the issue has to do with the type of antivirus that is seen in South America. You see, this ship sailed out of South Argentina and went through the Drake Passage and on up to West Africa. Well, this is exactly the part of the world that has the Andes strain of the Hantavirus. Now, most Hantaviruses, in fact almost all of them, transmit from either the droppings, the urine, or the saliva of rodents into humans. It's not human-to-human transmission. Generally, there is documentation that the Andes type of virus, which is endemic in places like Chile and Argentina, actually can do that. And so that's why this possibility is being looked at. So think about this, folks. If you're on this ship and this is happening around you, they have gone to Cape Verde, which is the final destination there in West Africa, kind of by the Canary Islands, and they have not been allowed to get off the ship. So this can be very distressing for people on board the ship about what they do and exactly what's going to happen to them and whether or not they're sick, because the incubation period here is quite long. And it kind of makes me think what you would do in that type of a situation. Now many, almost all of them, are being confined to their rooms because they don't want to have any further contamination if this is an actual virus that can be transmitted. So there is a possibility that it could be, and obviously they're taking that very seriously. So what would you do if you were on board that ship? Well, I want to tell you a little bit about some of the information that is being learned about viruses in general, our innate immune system during the incubation period, and some of the studies that have been done in the last 10 years to inform what it is that you might do. So we're going to go through a flash educational thing on our immune system. So your immune system is divided into two groups. There's the innate immune system and the adaptive. The adaptive has to do with antibodies. The innate has to do with looking at things that the body knows without having an antibody made to it that it is foreign. So in other words, your body has innately inside of it the ability to detect things that should not be there. And that's the important part of the innate immune system. The innate immune system has an aector molecule called interferon. This is an aector molecule that has activity against most viruses regardless of their strain. So when we're talking about cells like the natural killer cells, monocytes, the interferon response is so important that most viruses that are successful at infecting us have to have a way around interferon. So interferon is going to be the key that we're talking about. And this goes back quite a ways. I mean, even back to 2002, we knew that the major battle, the nuclear arms race, if you will, of immunology between humans and viruses had at the center of them interferon. And you can see this going back, that type 1 interferons are antiviral cytokines, and really they are at the forefront of what our body uses. There's a system called the JAK-STAT pathway that actually increases interferon. And as it says here, these are the workhorses of the interferon response. They set up these antiviral, anti-proliferative immunogregulatory states. However, most, if not all viruses, have evolved a broad spectrum of strategies to block and interfere with the interferon pathway. This was an article that was published back when COVID-19 was just coming around, and this is Nancy Go. This is on June 1st, the type 1 response in response to COVID-19. Notice what she says. Thus, it could be said that patients most susceptible to severe disease in COVID-19, in this case, are those that cannot mount an effective early antiviral immune response. And this shows that very clearly. You can see that people with the highest levels of interferon had the most mild disease. Those that had the lower levels had the more critical disease. You can see that here. That was a study that's been repeated over and over again in papers and very prestigious journals such as Science. We see that together, these two papers explain nearly 14% of severe COVID cases. What are they? Inborn errors of interferon actually cause problems with life-threatening COVID-19. Autoantibodies against type 1 interferons in patients with life-threatening COVID-19. You can see here in the graph, interferon alpha, that the higher levels that you have, the better you're going to be. These patients that had mutations had almost no interferon, and they were all severe. And that's because that SARS-CoV-2, and I know we're talking about Hantavirus here, but we're going to get to that. SARS-CoV-2 has a gene called MAC1, and it's required for suppressing interferon so that it can actually do its dirty work. This is the picture of the protein right here, and specifically MAC1 right there. And we could actually figure out what gene it was. And so we could take the virus and put mutations in the MAC1 gene to see if we could affect and change how SARS-CoV-2 behaved. So if you take, like they did here, call 3 bronchial cells or alveolar cells, and you put them on a petri dish and infect them with SARS-CoV-2 virus in the wild type, as you see here in blue, you'll see that very little interferon is made in any of these types of assays that are looking at these cytoines or interferons. So whether we're talking about interferon beta, interferon lambda, all of these other intermediaries, this is interferon beta, interferon lambda. Once again, notice that the wild type, the one where MAC1 is working, you have these very low interferon levels. This is not good. This is bad, because your immune system is not going to work in these situations. Now you take that MAC1 gene and put a bunch of mutations in it so that it doesn't work well. And now you infect these cells with that type of virus that have puny MAC1 genes. And what happens is that virus really doesn't do a thing. Notice that the interferon response, when you don't have the MAC1 gene, is nice and robust. It works well. It does what it needs to do. In this trial, those MAC1 genes that were mutated in the virus didn't do a thing to those cells. This leads us to a clinical trial. So people recognize this, and this was a paper that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Those people who watch this, I always get a chuckle. They say, "Oh, this is like woo-woo. This is crazy stuff. This is quackery stuff that you're talking about." Why? It's because I'm not talking about an FDA-approved drug. That's the only reason. But we're looking at science. We're looking at straight science. And here is a clinical trial published in probably one of the most prestigious journals on the planet, the New England Journal of Medicine. And what were they doing? They understood this idea that viruses need to disable interferon in the body for them to get a foothold. And so what they decided to do was early treatment with interferon lambda in CO-19. So this was a randomized controlled trial, almost 2,000 subjects. Didn't matter whether they were vaccinated or unvaccinated. It didn't really matter. What they were looking for is, could they prevent clinical outcomes so that they could reduce hospitalization or ER visits. They took pegylated interferon lambda and gave it subcutaneously. And what did they find? They found that for hospitalization or ED visit, 28 days after getting infected to the time when the trial stopped, they were able to cut the amount of hospitalization or emergency room visits by 50%. So the absolute reduction here was 5.6 US, 2.7 for those of you who like absolute reduction numbers. That's an absolute reduction of 2.9%, which means you only need to treat 35 people with this to prevent one hospitalization. That's pretty good. What about vaccinated versus unvaccinated? It really didn't matter. You still were able to cut about 50% the amount of times that you had to go to the emergency room. What about death or hospitalization? Again, 50% reduction. Adverse events? You would think that giving pegylated interferon lambda would increase the number of adverse events versus placebo. It was actually less. Well, why is that? Well, because they probably couldn't tell the ill effects of the virus from the actual intervention. And so overall, you had less side effects with the intervention and less mortality or hospitalization. So the conclusion was that getting more interferon in your body early on reduced the ED visit and related hospitalization by approximately 50%. Folks, that's huge.